Good evening. Good evening. Well, no, it's okay. Welcome to Matter. My name is Stephen Collins. I'm the CEO here at Matter. This is the latest installment of a program that we produce with Northshore University HealthSystem. I just want to talk a little bit about that relationship and a little bit about Matter, and then I will turn it over to the panel. So Matter, we are just about 2.5 years old. We're a healthcare technology incubator and innovation hub. We work with about 200 healthcare startups and have about 70 corporate and institutional partners. And our thesis around innovation is really that we need to bring entrepreneurs together with industry leaders and healthcare executives and insurance companies and investors to collaborate on building solutions to meaningful healthcare problems that can be built in ways that can really be adopted rapidly by the industry. One of the things that we like to do is convene conversations about topics that are really relevant to innovators, relevant to technology innovation, relevant to kind of the evolution of healthcare. Precision health, precision medicine has been one of those topics that consistently bubbles up to the radar, and a topic that we've spent a lot of time this year and will continue going forward to really dig in around. I think everyone looks at the myriad sources of new data and the myriad different ways of doing things and sees a healthcare future that is very different from what it is today. And the question that a lot of people have is, how do we get there? And who's going to pay for these solutions, especially in the near term and the midterm, and what are they going to pay for? And I think we'll have a really interesting conversation around that tonight. We produced this series, Healthcare for What's Next, with Northshore University HealthSystem. It was actually the first health system that signed on to be a partner, so they'll always be special. We love all of our health system partners, but they were extra special and have really had a great relationship with them. And as they continue to evolve and develop their precision health capabilities and roll out new tools, and we've been pretty consistently impressed with what they've done and the capabilities that they're able to showcase and really help us understand some of what is being used in practice. And so we'll see some of that this evening as well. And I'm really appreciative that that we have the opportunity to produce this series together with them. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Arun Bhatia, who has really put this program together and has been working both with Northshore on this series, but also really coordinating all of our activities around precision health. So please welcome Arun Bhatia. Thank you.
Thanks. Good evening. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. Real briefly, I just want to offer a quick introduction to our speakers, and then we're going to have Julia give a little bit of a talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have a panel discussion. As Steve mentioned, this is a partnership program that we do in partnership with Northshore. This is also a really interesting topic because it fits into a strategic area of focus for Matter this year that we've launched. It's actually one of 3 areas that we're looking at. One is in healthy aging, one is health data, and this one is in precision health. So the conversation of this is very, very timely. Our goal from these immersion programs is really to, as Steve mentioned, bring different stakeholders to the table. And as we start to think about what are some ways that we can really start to impact the healthcare system and really make innovations meaningful and move them forward, we recognize that we need to have all of these different stakeholders at the table. And so our goal from these immersion programs is to have conversations, roundtables, experiences with our innovators and our industry partners that will actually help move these opportunities forward. So with that, One of the things that's been really interesting about precision health, as we've talked to different stakeholders, pharma, health systems, patients, providers, payers, it's been very obvious that precision health has a very different definition, value to each of those stakeholders. But one thing that has been fairly clear, as Steve mentioned, is we have to figure out how these things are going to get paid for, how these precision health tools are paid for. So I'm really excited about the conversation this evening. So let me just briefly introduce both of our speakers and our guests this evening, and then I'll turn it over to Julia. Our first speaker, Dr. Julia Trosman, co-founder and co-director for the Center for Business Models Healthcare. It's a healthcare services research organization focused on innovative cancer care delivery models, precision oncology, and related coverage and reimbursement approaches. Dr. Trosman is actually a friend of ours from the Feinberg School of Medicine. She also holds an appointment at CSF, and she's really been focused on the development and implementation of personalized cancer care delivery and reimbursement models. So we look forward to hearing from her. Dr. Karen Call is a chair of the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at Northshore University HealthSystem, and is a clinical professor of pathology at University of Chicago's Pritzker School of Medicine. She's a board-certified anatomic pathologist and also a molecular genetic pathologist, and she's been in this field for a number of years, as you will hear from her experiences later on. And if any of you get an opportunity, I'll do a quick plug for you. She was an expert witness in a Senate hearing last year in September. There's a video online to go hear about the value of LDTs, lab-developed tests, and the role that plays not only in innovation, but the role that plays in care. So if you have an opportunity after this program to check that out, it is very, very insightful. So with that, thank you both for being here, and we will turn it over to Julia for the first start of the presentation.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present on this very important topic. Any payers today in the audience? No? So I can speak freely? I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. All right. Okay. But seriously, as a matter of disclosure, this work has been funded by the grants from National Institutes of Health, by foundations, by commercial funding from diagnostic companies, but not not by payers. So there's no conflict of interest. If I defend payers, I really have no skin in the game. So very quickly, topics for my presentation. I will give quick background and key concepts, just a very quick overview. Then I will review the framework, a typical framework that payers, and I will private payers, that they use in decision making whether to cover a precision medicine diagnostic or not. And I will talk about factors, criteria, challenges from the product development perspective, etc. Then I will talk about some of the new challenges that are related to the introduction of next generation sequencing in multi-gene testing. If there is time, I will also talk about a couple of aspects of coverage, insurance coverage in the era of value-based healthcare. So throughout this, my talk, I will focus, as I mentioned, on the diagnostic side of precision medicine. Obviously, there's therapeutic and intervention side as well. And my examples will come from oncology. Everything that I will describe is applicable to across diseases, but my experience, 95% of my experience has been in oncology, so examples will be in the area of oncology and cancer precision testing. So very quick background. The work that I am doing on coverage, reimbursement and coverage for precision medicine is predominantly through my appointment with UCSF. And I'm collaborating with health economists there and physicians at the Transperth, which is a Center for Personalized Medicine Research. And For 10 years now, it's been an amazing experience. I had the privilege of facilitating what we call Payer Advisory Board. So it is 12 payers. 8 of them are the largest payers in the country. That includes our local HCSC, basically eight largest, Anthem, United Health, Aetna, Humana, Kaiser Permanente, et cetera. And we also have 4 leading regional plans as well. And so the members who participate in our activities within the board are senior executives. Some of them are chief medical officers, like within Kaiser, we have chief medical officer of Kaiser Permanente, we have VPs of medical policy, et cetera. So I'm sharing this information so that you know where this information is coming. And so with that payer board, we do interview studies on specific technologies, case studies, and we've done things like gene expression profiling in cancer. We've done next generation tumor sequencing. We've done cancer hereditary risk panels, et cetera. And we also review policy, publicly available coverage policies, and we conduct roundtable meetings. So we focus specifically in the realm of reimbursement, which is pretty broad. We focus on coverage policy specifically. So is it possible to get paid for a diagnostic or a service without an explicit positive coverage policy? Yes, it is. Is it a reliable source of reimbursement? No, it is not. And so if you want to be sustainable with your product or service, if you want consistent patient access, you want to have a formal, explicit, positive coverage for your product. So this is why we're focusing on that. So let me talk about the framework that payers use in their coverage decisions. So in general, the main criterion is this technology or service, and this is applicable across modalities, drug, procedure. Is it medically necessary and not experimental investigational? So it has to be both. And so typically, payers use some variation of these 5 criteria that you see here. These come from Blue Cross Blue Shield Association TAC, which is named differently now. But they're pretty sensible, but they're also broad. Now, when looking at diagnostics, molecular and other diagnostics, payers use a more involved, more detailed framework. And that framework is based on an approach that has been introduced by CDC probably 15 years ago, called ACCE, Analytic Validity, Clinical Utility, and then what they call ELSI, Ethical, Legal, Social Implications. And so that framework of analytic validity, clinical utility is still used. And it has been effective for payers. Also, I will talk about yet another group of factors, which is healthcare factors, which actually may impact how payers use evidence and view some of these factors. But before then, very important, there are so many different modalities now, and so many, even in the diagnostic space, with the acceleration of technology and science. So many of these products that it's not possible for any payer to issue positive or negative coverage for all of these tests. So if you're interested to get on their radar, how do you do it? So these are some of the factors or criteria that payers use. Again, they look at disease significance, prevalence, seriousness. For example, is this a diagnostic in a common cold or cancer? Need for the product. Over the years, we have heard some direct comments from payers. How many tests for breast cancer can we have? Can we focus on something else? Again, they also use the initial demand or the use from their network of their providers. Is that test starts sort of popping up? They look at health technology assessment body reviews, but very importantly, they also look at costs. Now, there are 2 points in this whole process when payers look at costs. They look at it before the whole coverage decision process and after, but not during. Because again, during their review, they focus really on the merit of a test or a modality, meaning, again, risks and outcomes and, care delivery concerns and such, but not on cost. So, and then of course, cost comes in later for covered technologies when there's a pricing process, et cetera. So let's talk about the actual coverage framework. Analytic validity, clinical validity, very important, relatively straightforward, definitely not trivial. So, you know, validity, analytic validity talks to can we accurately actually measure the marker that we're saying we will measure. Clinical validity talks to the accuracy of actually determining the connection, the associated phenotype between the marker and the phenotype. So here we talk about prevalence, penetrance, and sorry, clinical sensitivity, specificity, etc. So payers look at all of this, but these factors are sort of necessary but not sufficient. Where some of the complexity comes is in the notion of clinical utility. Again, sounds relatively straightforward. What is the clinical outcome, or what is the clinical impact of using a test or an assay or a diagnostic modality? However, this is where challenges lie, both for payers and for developers of the tests. And the challenge is in variability. You've seen one payer, basically you've seen one payer. Different payers define clinical utility potentially in different terms. And even for different products. So this variation goes not only across payers, but also across products. So for example, if you study one payer's coverage decisions on, let's say, one group of tests, it doesn't mean that this same, evidentiary criteria or the same definition of clinical utility will be applied to the next group of tests. And what we heard from many developers and at many conferences, a lot of diagnostic test developers feel that the bar for evidence for diagnostics is too high. It's just too high. They feel it's not realistic. It's stagnating the field growth and progress. Again, there are many who don't agree with this. So, a little more on definition of clinical utility. So it could be a puzzle that each payer sort of assembles, potentially every time that they look at the new product category, new test. And so some of the pieces of the puzzle include things like, for example, decision utility. This is something very important. Sometimes it is, again, one of those necessary but not sufficient factors. But we know some tests that have been basically, that have been able to gain coverage just on evidence of clinical utility. I'm sorry, decision utility. The answer, or the question here is, does this test, do test results impact treatment decisions? Then, some other tests, for example, there is a question of actionability. Are there any associated interventions? For example, this is in asymptomatic sort of disease predisposition space. It's very, very important. Can this test accurately identify populations who could be indicated for a specific intervention? And then, of course, there is this whole area of net outcomes. How do you define that? What is the approach? What are we measuring? What is the time frame, et cetera? So this is where a lot of developers are actually commenting that this is where the bar is potentially too high. So unfortunately, again, same variation, same difficulty in defining the evidentiary requirements from different payers. So variation comes not only at the angle of endpoints, the ones that I described, but also what are the levels of evidence that would be required. And this could vary from test to test. The quality and number of studies, the strength of evidence. Some payers actually look at, for example, the impact factor of where specific studies have been published. So again, all of this is very important. So in general, I would offer this comment. Payers do prefer evidence on the higher end of the spectrum. However, would they be reasonable, and accept the evidence that is of a lower level? Absolutely. Otherwise, we probably would not be covering any diagnostics today. So just something very important to remember. Let me also talk about healthcare factors. This is something that could actually impact a decision and how payers view the evidence in the long term. So, things like, for example, patient demand, physician demand. it will not be a factor outside of evidence. You still need the evidence, but this is a factor that could impact the ultimate decision. So again, these factors are also variable by payer, by product, but payers do look at guideline recommendations. They do look at public opinion in some markets. So for example, we had some payers who said anything to do with cancer in our specific market is very sensitive, and we just tend to be sort of pioneers in establishing coverage. And so it's very important. They look at health technology assessment reviews. Some of them look at Medicare coverage. Some of them say, no, this is not a factor for me. Care delivery issues, they want to make sure that something that they cover, actually, there is a infrastructure, logistics, and all the providers know how to actually deliver the test, use results, etc. Obviously, a huge controversy around the FDA approval. And the question we actually asked payers, and we had some specific case studies of laboratory-developed tests and sort of comparable products in the gene expression profile space. One product did not go through the voluntary FDA review and approval. The other product did. We asked, did that approval make any difference? And honestly, it didn't. So, and the question was about Oncotype DX, which has been covered for ages, and Memaprint, who gained FDA approval probably 10 years ago or 8 years ago, and coverage is just now starting to happen. So, and finally, I mentioned costs and cost effectiveness. The only scenario when the cost impact comes into play during coverage decisions is if there are comparable products or equivalent products, and one of them is lower in cost. So this is when they would look at cost. But this is a fascinating study that we did, and I'm still fascinated by just how much a time frame, like a timeline can tell you. So what you see here is this is a part of our study of Oncotype DX. We looked at all the events that happened around payer coverage, and so the green diamonds here are coverage decisions by 7 major payers. We're talking about national payers, and so you see how if you look at the timeline, obviously each payer was impacted by different events. And also what you see here is Oncotype DX by Genomic Health gained coverage practically on decision utility evidence only. And we reviewed those studies. Some of them had like 31 patients. So again, as I mentioned, the bar of the evidentiary bar varies. But also what's interesting here is that, the last payer here, the 2008 payer, actually what they said was it was not necessarily a specific study that was published or a specific event. They just saw the acceptance, of that test in their network, among their oncology providers, and they decided to cover the test. So we just did a similar sort of analysis in a study that was published around NIPT coverage for high-risk pregnancies. So again, very fascinating analysis. Also, I wanted to offer this diagram. This is one of the studies that we did with the payer board. We had 11 payers participating. We asked them, what are some of the technology assessment reviews that you take into account in your coverage decisions? And you see a variation, in the number of various bodies that are taken into account, and also in what specific reviews are taken into account. What it means for, let's say, the product development community is you absolutely need to consider and approach those health technology assessment companies that are approachable. Some of them are not approachable. But just keep in mind that again, just a positive review by something like a Blue Cross Blue Shield Tech, or it's called Evidence Street now, doesn't necessarily give you coverage. And now that it's not tech anymore, not sure how many payers use it. So in summary, in general, some considerations for product developers. Are payers open to a dialogue? Absolutely. We know many payers who You can contact them, obviously, in confidence. They will talk to you. It doesn't mean that they will cover your test, but they will definitely have a dialogue with you. Also, there are multiple levels of having a dialogue with payers. They participate in panels. They participate in some bodies who are trying to put together stakeholders, etc. So that's a positive. Also, again, some of the calls for more standards in coverage and more predictability in coverage. From my opinion, humble opinion, not going to happen. Not anytime soon. That remains elusive. And again, just to sort of defend payers on that front, what is predictable in our healthcare? Science is not predictable. Can we predict what kind of new tests that we're going to get to even review for payers in the next 5 to 10 years? Probably not. Healthcare is not predictable. How can you ask payers to create a predictable framework for something that they don't even know what's coming their way, if that makes sense? Again, no conflict of interest on my part. Also, just another interesting consideration I would like to offer is variability in coverage approaches across payers is a huge barrier for product developers. It means basically you need to go to each payer, understand how they look at things, and review their policies, etc. However, it also is an opportunity. And the opportunity lies in finding a payer who would be willing to take that risk with you. We have a number of cases, and actually I worked with many of those companies who were able to find that payer. Like for genomic health, for example, it was Aetna. This is not confidential; it's been public knowledge. For some other product companies, this could be a smaller payer. But then again, you have a press release, you go through the detailed development of that coverage policy, you gain experience, and then you move on to other payers. So this is I think an advantage of our health system in comparison, for example, with UK, for example, where you really have one decision body. And imagine one decision body, and I'm completely apolitical. This is not a political conversation. But from this perspective, imagine one decision body who makes all decisions for 330 million people in this country. These decisions would take so long because, imagine the responsibility on the shoulders of those decision makers. So moving on. As you talk to payers, again, your evidence probably will always be lower than ideal, unfortunately. However, if you're transparent, if you're thoughtful, if you show the strategy, they will work with you, they will talk to you. And finally, cost analysis. We heard from a lot of payers that many companies bring cost analysis, budget impact, etc., lay on their door and say, oh, we will reduce your costs. Payers almost never believe these. However, do you have to have these analyses? Absolutely, you need to develop them. And preferably if you have an academic partner like a health economist or something, that's good, but still you need to do this. How are we doing on time? Okay, so let me talk a bit about some of the additional challenges that are posed by multi-gene sequencing. And this again, we conducted 2 studies. One was on tumor sequencing, and the other one on payer criteria and challenges for coverage of cancer predisposition panels. So, do payers agree with these wonderful opportunities and wonderful benefits that these multi-gene panels provide? Absolutely. And so again, these include multiple utility, for example, because these, and I'm talking about tumor sequencing panels specifically. A specific advantage is the inclusion of both established and novel genes in one panel. And so you can, by running one test, you have clinical utility, you have research utility, you have the opportunity to match patients with clinical trials. And you also have the, what we call it, the care delivery utility, the advantage. Save that precious tumor sample, turnaround time faster for patients at the end stage of the disease, etc. There's also the cumulative benefit. We hear from oncologists, for example, that they look at the results of these tumor sequencing panels, and they understand the full sort of tumor behavior, tumor pathways, and this allows them to characterize the tumor, not only individual markers. But these wonderful advantages actually present a huge challenge for payers. And here what we're seeing is it's not just the challenge of developing additional evidence. It's not just one more test. This is a disruptor. You know, these benefits do not fit the existing coverage framework. So even, again, when payers do want to consider them, the framework just is not aligned with these types of benefits. The current coverage framework, for example, the definition of medically necessary and not experimental investigational, it just doesn't fit these panels that have both. You know, in the cancer space specifically, for example, you know, NCCN guidelines, a huge body, hugely reputable. Each guideline on the first page says that the best treatment setting for cancer patients is what? Clinical trial. And so from that perspective, it's medically necessary, right? But it's also investigational. So, you know, since I'm short of time, on time, basically, just, you know, very quickly, this is a huge challenge. So we worked with payers, some of these new evidence models, for example, N of 1. What is it? They don't know how to look at it. You know, things like these umbrella studies, what is it, bucket trials. These are so new. They don't know how to look at this evidence. And so we need more dialogue. But also what we need, we believe, is, you know, in the world of potential solutions, my group of collaborators believe that we probably need some efforts to modernize this framework, but it has to be done in a non-contentious way. It has to be done in a very thoughtful way in collaboration with payers. And this is something, you know, that we will start working on. In the meantime, you know, as product developers, if you're in the multi-gene space, this is something just to understand better and honestly just struggle with. So thank you very much. Let me just go to the thank you. So again, lots to do.
Wonderful. So as we get the chairs set up on stage, I did want to invite all of you to visit our social QA. It's matter.socialqa.com. It's your way of engaging in questions. I'll have an opportunity to sort of read through them on the iPad. And so as you have questions, please go to that site on your smartphone, and then we will share those with the panelists. And I'd invite Karen and Julia to join us. So, Julia, thank you very much for that that description. Karen, let me actually ask you to share a little bit of background in your work in this space. And I was actually hoping you could also share with us a little bit about what you've seen from the diagnostic side. We talk about next generation sequencing, kind of leaving off where Julia did. Maybe talk to us a little bit about the first generation sequencing. How has that evolved over time? And especially as we talk about some of these diagnostics we have in terms. I'm curious as your thoughts on what you've seen.
So I'm a molecular pathologist, a traditionally trained pathologist, but I've been doing molecular since, well, quite a few years. So the year I opened my lab at Northwestern, it was 1987, was the year we got CPT code so we could actually bill, and it was the year the first CAP checklist for the inspection started. So it was really in the beginning. I would call it, I don't know if it's first generation, it was pre-sequencing. It was still in the days of Sanger. And so it's been fun to watch this evolve tremendously over the years. Nothing has coupled or nothing has been similar to the last 5 years. It's just taking off at an exponential rate. So when we started, we were doing clone your own probes and southern blots, et cetera. And fortunately, that's not what we're stuck with. But I've seen this happen at intervals over the years. You know, how are we going to get paid? The testing's too expensive. We've gone from Southerns to PCR to real-time PCR to now everything that we're doing today. And so these challenges kind of go in cycles, and so we see them over and over again. I think the lab's perspective is, you know, first and foremost, we want to serve the patients and our clinicians, and we need to do so in a quality manner. So the lab community has really, for better or for worse, policed itself through guidelines and inspections and that sort of thing to try and make sure that we're doing the right things, getting the right answers, and that sort of thing. That will lead us into LDTs, which we can talk about if there's time later. But there's a lot of development that has taken place in laboratories because the diagnostic companies simply have not been able to keep up with the pace of what's been happening in recent years. Reimbursement is always a challenge. There's grassroots efforts that go on with the professional societies to try to lobby to try to justify what we're doing, always try and increase reimbursement so we can cover our costs. Those are taking on, I think, a more anxious time given that our dollars are decreasing, and we're actually seeing that. Laboratory testing volumes are going up, and our reimbursement is going down significantly. So everyone's quite concerned about how we're going to face what's ahead. Part of that is driving the multi-gene panels that you're seeing now with next-gen sequencing. We find in the lab that we're working with tinier and tinier biopsies. There's not enough material to do individual gene panel testing, and we need to find ways to become efficient. So it's much more efficient for us to do a multi-gene panel and then farm out from that the data that we need to help that patient than to do individual assays for each patient's cancer. So we're trying to streamline those test methodologies to become more efficient and to save on costs that way. So operationally, it's running right up against what Julia was describing to you. So that's pretty interesting to watch that as well. On the quality side, again, the labs, as we develop tests, or even as we're adopting tests that are commercially available, have to go through the same parameters that Julia described, in that we're looking at clinical, analytic validity, clinical validity. Where we do run into trouble, though, is this clinical utility. And in my experience over the years, we've done a lot of testing in infectious disease by microbial PCR and such. That's very straightforward because you got this bug, you've got this disease, and it's fairly easy to do that. But as you get into the cancer areas or the heritable disease areas, it's much longer-term studies and much more difficult to get that data. And labs themselves are not really funded to do that sort of collection. So I think we all need to, as a community, look for novel ways to partner with other groups to try to get the data that we need to do to show clinical utility, because I agree that's going to become more and more important.
So as we think about, one of the, just to jump off, Julia, your last slide, you mentioned multi-gene testing. And we, before there was a point at which we thought one gene to one disease, there's a correlation. I think we're learning that that's not the case. It's not only multiple genes that impact disease, but it's things outside genomics. Could be other omics, could be other microbial factors, environmental factors. And from an innovator standpoint, we're actually trying to figure out what are the right pieces of data that paint a picture of disease. But what it's sounding like is that is actually, from a reimbursement standpoint, making things very challenging, very complex, and also from a clinical utility standpoint, very complex. So maybe a tough question here is, they seem to be diverging paths. How do we kind of figure out how this moves forward?
Modernize the coverage framework, but it's a joke, but not. So in general, again, I think it's, if you're talking about multiple modalities painting one picture, if we can't figure out how to review and assess the value of even one test with multiple targets, it's basically kind of, even amplified problem. So again, it's hard for payers to look at the overall picture and understand the value of all, that picture. Coverage for that picture will come in pieces. So they're going to want to understand for each of these pieces, and if these are different tests, metabolic, genomic, other, what is the incremental value of that specific test in that picture? Also, again, because there's just honestly no more money in the system. We have what we have. Is this test substituting something that we were doing before? That would be wonderful if it did. So for example, are there any, let's say, downstream impacts on, let's say, care or diagnostics or anything that it would impact that would allow to compensate for that test, for the cost of that test, for the effort, et cetera. So these are going to be very important. I don't know if I answered your question, but really, understanding what is the value of each test in that overall picture.
And then from a clinical utility perspective, we had a roundtable right before this where we were talking about the challenge of implementing this sort of at care. with all the information that's available. Given that, physician championing is going to be very important, even from a reimbursement standpoint, how do we start to break down the walls of these tests getting adopted sort of at the clinical?
I'll make two comments, if I may. One is on the issue of clinical utility. There are places where we can do this more effectively, and it's going to require very robust EMRs and systems where we can harvest the data and looking at settings where we can actually get a yes or no answer, this is good or not. We do better on the hospital inpatient side because it's a episode of care that we can draw some lines around. And so things like screening for carriage of MRSA or C. diff, we can get some concrete answers there and show fairly concretely that there's a benefit to do this. But when we get into the broader context of cancer or chronic disease, it's going to become much more challenging. The comment that we addressed in the roundtable beforehand is in adoption. And the comment I made is that none of us learned this in medical school, and the medical students aren't learning this because the pace at which our knowledge is accumulating has hit such a level that it's changing daily. So many of us, including myself, have been involved heavily in I was going to say graduate medical education, which would be our residents and fellows, but even continuing education. How do we educate the physician who's been out for 5 to 10 years to use these new tools and do that in an effective way? And it's a considerable challenge. So really infiltrating all of the organizations that provide medical education for those of us who are out in practice is going to be key. Locally, we need to provide a lot of support to our physicians. We can use the EMR to provide just-in-time data and links and things like that that will fit into their workflow, face-to-face interactions, but there's a tremendous amount of education before I think they reach a comfort level. And in some instances, actually giving them examples in patients where they can see how this fits into their practice and their workflow and see whether there's a benefit or not to them.
There's a question on here in terms of, Julia, the timeline that you shared. The question is, it seemed like Medicare coverage was a tipping point on that timeline. For private payers, how important or how influential is Medicare coverage, which I think we believe it is influential. Or maybe a follow-on to that question is, have you seen examples of private payers moving separately or independently in terms of coverage?
That's a great question. So on that timeline, all the payers that you see plotted on that time frame, we interviewed them as well. One payer took that into account. One. And again, they also took into account a lot of other factors. I agree that Medicare coverage is a very, very influential factor in general, in terms of drugs, procedures, et cetera, not necessarily in terms of genomics and molecular diagnostics. A lot of payers actually, they want to make their own decisions. Same goes for guidelines. We heard specifically from large payers, they will take, let's say, NCCN guidelines in the area of cancer. Let's say the drug compendium. They will take it, and this will be their formulary, but not with diagnostics, because they want to make their own decisions. With Medicare specifically, if I may just elaborate a little bit, again, as developers of these tests, you have to be very careful because something that was uncovered maybe 10 years ago, obviously the structure existed, is the whole difference between local and national coverage. And some laboratory developed test companies, basically, for example, they went for local coverage, and then that de facto meant national. It meant national coverage because, for example, let's be explicit here, Genomic Health, right? Oncotype DX, they got local California coverage. That meant national because all tests were basically sent to California, which was covered by the local Medicare contractor. Talking about public payers, private payers, they did not like it. They didn't because, again, that implied that Medicare in general endorsed the test. And many of the, again, on that timeline, many of these payers specifically ignored that Medicare coverage.
From the standpoint of, so obviously the topic is around reimbursement of these tests. There have been some stories around health systems that are basically reimbursing these on their own or covering the costs of these tests on their own. There's some examples of prenatal tests that they believe are valuable offerings. So one question here, and I'm expanding on it a little bit, to what extent are patients willing to pay for these tests on their own out of pocket? And to what extent are health systems even thinking about in tests that they believe strongly enough in to cover it on their own?
So perhaps I'll take a crack at that, and I'll have two comments there. We're definitely entering an age of consumerism, and I think many health systems are trying to figure out how we put a real price list out there so patients know what they're paying for. Our prices depend currently under insurance coverage on not only the insurance policy, but what employer the patient is with, and therefore what coverage. And so it's a mess. I have no idea what we charge for most of our tests because it is so unique for each patient in their setting. So it's a real challenge, and I think somehow we need to move beyond that so we know what the charges really are. There is data out there, I think, on what patients will pay for. Some patients can't pay for things. Some patients can pay a lot. So there's going to be a spectrum of what people will pay for. And we need to be able to address that as well. But right now, we're not well positioned to do that. As far as health systems covering it, I think as we assume more risk, and again, this is going to hit the inpatient side first, outpatient later, there will be decisions made around if we're going to be taking care of a patient population for a certain amount per member per month or whatever it's going to be, what will help us be more effective and efficient in taking care of those patients. And so again, I'll use the example of MRSA screening. We know we can do that. We know what it costs, and we know it has very significant downstream benefits. So we would want to incorporate that, whether it's paid for or not. It's a benefit for us in caring for those patients and preventing more complications. So I think we can take that model, more complicated it will be, of course, but we can take that model and try and expand that a bit more broadly and make some of those decisions. And I think we'll have to.
And on the side, going back to the conversation about HTAs, these health tech assessment organizations, can you expand a little bit on sort of what's the difference between these and some of the groups within the payer organizations that are making these coverage decisions? And the folks that are within these payer organizations, what types of folks are we talking about that are on these committees that are making these types of coverage decisions for the innovators in the audience who are trying to understand
Great question.
who they're selling to?
The very short answer, it varies. But in general, we're talking about very informed groups of experts of various specialties. Some of the, let me talk about large payers, for example. Again, it also varies. These groups may include, let's say, MDs, PhDs, may include PhDs, may include epidemiologists. But some of them actually, we were surprised. Some of the major payers, for example, have a group of basically, master degree levels. Not to say that they're not qualified, but they're not even clinical. And so that specific organization uses more health technology assessment reviews than some others. And so therefore, because the staff varies, their processes also vary, And so, again, some of them, the majority of large payers have really, really extensive processes and a lot of expertise in areas. And if they don't have specific expertise when they evaluate, for example, like a specific test, we did a study on a test for rheumatoid arthritis, for example, and we asked, obviously, how many rheumatologists are there on these committees? Not a whole lot. So they do go to their respective network and they solicit input from patients. In terms of health technology assessment bodies, it's a challenge. Some of them are transparent, and you can actually, their reviews are publicly available, and some of them are not. Obviously, government-like bodies like USPSTF, for example, United States Preventive Services Task Force, everything is available publicly. But are they approachable? Absolutely not. There's some other bodies that could be approachable, at least from the perspective of, can you review my test? Not from the perspective, can I get a favorable review? So understanding the landscape of health technology assessment is very, very important. I would say in the past, one probably most influential body in that arena was Blue Cross Blue Shield Tech. But again, their reviews were available publicly. Now they're not. So I'm really not sure. I don't know if anybody is here from the association. I'd love to find out myself.
We can find out. Let me just ask a question around, so we talk about data and the value of data as a key input to a lot of these precision health tools. An interesting question is, genomic data is structured, disease activity is contextual. And I'll broaden that to saying genomic profiling can be very helpful. I think one of the challenges maybe payers have is, does your genomic profile actually change over time? So a test that you take today, testing for predisposition of a disease, does that change over time? How do you balance or reconcile the data piece? If genomic data is indeed structured and disease changes over time, how does a payer reconcile that?
Did you want to talk about this?
I can give the clinical side,
Sure.
if that's fine, and we'll complement one another.
Sure.
So the genomic data is structured, but there's a lot of challenges that hospital systems, labs have to figure out how to do with. It's data beyond anything we've dealt with before in terms of the amount of data, the complexity of the data. In some settings, yes, it will change over time. I think your heritable genome won't. Cancers definitely will, so you may need to go back and resample that tumor as a patient undergoes treatment and watch how that goes, and we don't yet know how frequently and how that's going to be paid for. But I think one of the challenges we're dealing with, even for your heritable genome, your germline, is the knowledge is changing. And so, to stay up to date with someone's genome sequence requires that you go back and continually interrogate that data and make sure that as new knowledge has come to, light, that we can act upon it in an appropriate way. And that's something that's quite new, and none of us in medicine, I think, have dealt with that. That's a big question that's there. The clinical data is a mess, quite honestly. It's not in discrete data fields. We talked about this a little bit in the pre-meeting, and I think health systems are moving into better EMRs that will allow access to this data, but right now we're really struggling at how to get information about other risk factors, treatment, outcome, et cetera, out of our medical records. And that's going to continue to be a challenge for a while. And that's what we need to really answer some of the questions that you're discussing.
Of course. So from the payer perspective, again, it's a multifaceted question. Let me just talk to a couple of aspects. Aspect number one, do payers understand that in multiple clinical, like in many clinical situations, there might be either repeat or even serial testing or retesting? Yes. So, especially when it comes to tumor genome, it's obvious, it could be heterogeneous, tumor mutates, et cetera, et cetera. So now when they look at some of these, tumor tests, liquid biopsy tests, some of these new tests, they ask, so, what you're pitching me, how many times am I going to cover this? And so it's very important to create the entire pathway. That is, the diagnostic pathway that is aligned with the disease pathway. And so at some point, again, if it benefits, if you show the benefit of this serial testing, it's going to be covered. In terms of what in the, the disease predisposition testing, payers really do understand that, let's say, what we know today about the genome is not what we're going to know tomorrow or in 5 years. So many test developers come and say, why don't we just collect all these novel variants and variants of unknown significance? And when we know more, we will just contact those patients and say, hey, we know what that means. Payers are extremely skeptical. Like this whole recontacting, it is not something they believe in because there's no infrastructure for that. In fact, we did a little study with some genetic counseling offices, and what they do is they say, yeah, we have a little database. The database is a spreadsheet. This is not an infrastructure for recontacting. And so if we want payers or anybody else to be serious about this type of approach, we need a better infrastructure, whether it's in electronic medical record or somehow secured. And it also alerts both clinicians and the patients when new information does come along.
So a question I would raise about that, however, is, patients don't stay with one payer, and so as they're moving from job to job or, payer to payer, is that going to fit with this model?
Challenge. Let me just ask again, because we've got innovators in the room. I want to ask a couple questions on some very tactical strategies. That if you're an innovator developing a precision health tool, what are some strategies given the framework that you've shared? What are some of the strategies that they can take? One question that was asked was around patient advocacy groups, and again, I'm going to expand on it a little bit. What impact does patient advocacy groups or other disease foundations have on coverage decisions? Are those partnerships that innovators and small startup companies should begin to accelerate and form if it helps in that process of reimbursement?
The answers are yes and yes. The support from an advocacy group, does it guarantee coverage? Does it improve your chances? Probably not. It all comes back to evidence. But if you can demonstrate that patients really understand the gist of the test, how it can be used, and can attest to its usefulness, it's very important. Again, that goes into that whole area of healthcare factors. It's a very important, again, patient demand and patient acceptance. But working with patient groups can benefit a test developer in many, many other ways. For example, there's an opportunity to work with some patient advocacies in collecting data. For example, they can really be partnering with a lot of test developers, which could be very, very important. And also again, in the area of patient education, in the area of patient access, very, very important.
Have you seen any at Northshore combinations or affiliations with patient groups or advocacy groups in terms of developing tests?
Not really in developing tests, but sometimes in doing the research that leads up to it. We've worked with a number of groups to gather materials to study further, and they can certainly be, I think, a strong voice in helping to move this along.
So as we think about then some of the frameworks that you shared tonight and some of the assessments in terms of clinical validity, clinical utility, what are some frameworks or some guidelines that an innovator should keep in mind as they're developing some new tests? There are a million things that a new startup can be focused on. As you think about that framework, what are some 1 or 2 or 3 key areas that they should be keeping in mind early on as they're developing?
Gosh, let me think. So, number 1, clinical validity, an absolute must. You cannot. You can talk about the use of test results and decisions or whatever, but clinical validity is an absolute cornerstone. When it comes to clinical utility, you probably cannot get around getting data on decision utility. It's again, necessary but not sufficient. So the first thing is, our doctors and patients take this test into account. Do doctors even order the test? Then again, what is the impact on treatment decisions? So it's a must. When it comes to the area of outcomes, that depends. So for example, there isn't an opportunity to argue potentially. If we're not talking about things like KRAS and anti-EGFR therapy, which are really like a companion diagnostic situation. If we're talking about let's say a test result and that informs an unrelated intervention, if there is an equivalent test, perhaps you can just basically use the argument of actionability based on clinical validity equivalence. It could be a very effective argument. But in the area of, if we're talking about companion diagnostics, then the success of your biomarker is really at the mercy of the success of the therapy. If the therapy is not effective, from that, who cares about whether your test was used in decisions? Does it make sense?
Yes.
So it really depends on the setting.
Mm-hmm. As far as any collaboration, so we had talked again in our roundtable about potential collaborations that, again, from a startup perspective, and again, we have a wealth of, whether it's payers, it's health systems, pharma companies here. Are there any unique collaboration models that you see that should be generated, even if they don't exist today, that might benefit both the payer as well as startups, test developers in this space, to actually help advance some of these technologies forward? What types of collaborations would really be needed early?
So collaboration is a wonderful word, of course, and you know it is meant to produce wonderful results, but it doesn't always. So, for example, are there opportunities for a let's say diagnostic company to partner or collaborate with a payer? Yes, and many payers would. So, you know, for example, these days many payers are interested. They have sort of, you know, research areas in their organizations. You can partner with them. You can frame studies. The question is this going to help you with coverage, and how long does it take? And then, you know, is that coverage, or is the data that you're going to produce, is this going to be palatable to another payer? And, you know, what about 50 other payers? So again, in forging these collaborations, some of these risks need to be evaluated. Also, I personally, I was involved in a you know, such pilot, a collaboration between like a company, a large academic center, and a payer, in understanding, again, you know, some of the clinical utility, care delivery utility of tumor sequencing. The issue is that the payer, unfortunately, you know, started to experience budgeting difficulties, and the research arm went away. What are you going to do? So there's no support from the payer. Again, if you're a diagnostic company, you have to be you have to face these issues. Wouldn't it be better to basically just go get funding, whatever is necessary, and develop evidence that could be attractive to a number of payers, not just one? In that fashion, to also guideline bodies, medical societies, and those health technology assessment bodies. So it's always a trade-off. It sounds really attractive. Is it going to be scalable?
Well, with that, we are actually out of time, but thank you very much to both of you for the information. I think that's a topic to be continued as we go. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.